Seeds of Empire, 1497–1600s. The British Empire begins quietly in 1497 when John Cabot, sailing for Henry VII, reaches Newfoundland. Unlike Spain and Portugal, already carving up vast riches from the Americas, England is a late starter. Through the 1500s, its overseas ventures are small, risky, and often failures. But the ambition is clear: break Spain's monopoly, find trade routes, and tap into the gold of exploration. By the mid-1500s, England is facing a powerful Spain. The Protestant Reformation and constant wars push Elizabeth I toward the seas. Privateers like Francis Drake plunder Spanish treasure fleets, while Walter Raleigh's Roanoke colony fails but plants the idea of North American settlement. At the same time, Ireland becomes England's first testing ground for colonization, with brutal plantations imposed on native populations. The real engine isn't conquest alone, it's commerce. In 1600, the East India Company is chartered, granting English merchants monopoly trade rights from Africa to Asia. And this matters. More than just ships, this single company grows into a private empire, with military forces that will eventually dominate India. Outcomes: by 1600, England has only fragile footholds: Newfoundland, small Caribbean outposts, failed Roanoke. But it has something more important: the blueprint. Naval daring, colonization through private ventures, plantations, slave trade involvement, and joint stock companies. Long-term impact: the seeds sown in this era grow into history's largest empire. By testing colonization in Ireland, piracy in the Caribbean, and trade in Asia, England effectively writes the playbook it will use for the next 400 years. What begins as scattered raids and risky start-ups becomes the foundation for an empire that will one day rule a quarter of the Earth's land and people. The First British Empire, 1600 to 1783. By 1600, England had the blueprint. Now it builds colonies. Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, becomes the first permanent North American settlement. Soon tobacco is flowing across the Atlantic, fueling profits and migration. In the Caribbean, sugar turns tiny islands like Barbados and Jamaica into some of the wealthiest colonies on Earth, built on slavery. By the late 1600s, Britain controls nearly half the transatlantic slave trade, transporting millions of Africans in a brutal system that funds its rise. Meanwhile, the East India Company tightens its grip in Asia, setting up fortified trading posts in India and beyond. These dual spheres, plantation colonies in the Americas and commercial outposts in Asia, define this first empire. Joint stock companies, naval escorts, and a rapidly growing merchant marine create what's essentially England's economic war machine. Religious and political tensions fuel expansion: Puritan migration to New England, Quakers to Pennsylvania. Scotland joins England in 1707, officially creating Great Britain, and suddenly imperial growth is backed by greater manpower and united capital. By mid-1700s, Britain controls colonies from Newfoundland to Jamaica, from India's coast to Gibraltar, with naval supremacy secured after victories over Spain and France. But power brings problems. Colonists see themselves less as dependents, more as self-governing communities. Britain's attempts to tax and regulate trade ignite fury. Climax: the American Revolution. By 1783, Britain loses 13 colonies, the core of its American empire. Outcome: a shattering blow, yet not a death. Losing America forces Britain to pivot even harder toward Asia and the Pacific. The East India Company takes center stage, setting the stage for the Raj. The First Empire is gone, but the seed for the Second Empire, richer and more global, is already planted. Long-term, this era proved one thing: Britain could build and manage a world system across oceans. Even with America lost, the structures of trade, slavery, naval power, and global finance remained, ready to fuel Britain's 19th century dominance. The Second British Empire, 1783 to 1815. Losing America in 1783 looked like the end. In reality, it was a pivot. Britain shifted focus eastward, to India, Africa, and the Pacific, launching what historians call the Second British Empire. The East India Company, already entrenched, seizes enormous power. After defeating Indian rulers at battles like Plassey, 1757, and Buxar, 1764, by the late 18th century Britain is effectively ruling Bengal, collecting taxes from tens of millions. India becomes the centerpiece of this new empire, its wealth funding Britain's global reach. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Captain James Cook's voyages open Australia and New Zealand. In 1788, the first penal colony is established at Botany Bay, sending convicts thousands of miles across the ocean. Migration that began as punishment evolves into settler colonies. Canada too becomes central, absorbing loyalist refugees fleeing the American Revolution. Africa also enters the pattern more strongly. Britain expands coastal trading posts, both for gold and the horrific continuation of the slave trade. By 1807, however, Parliament abolishes the trade, a moral turning point, even as slavery itself persists in colonies. This era is defined by war. Britain fights revolutionary and then Napoleonic France, 1793 to 1815. The Royal Navy becomes unstoppable. Trafalgar in 1805 cements sea supremacy. By defeating Napoleon in 1815, Britain emerges not weakened, but as the strongest global power. Outcome? In just 30 years, Britain transforms its empire, from loss in America to dominance in India, settlement in Australia, hold over Canada, and unrivaled command of the seas. Long-term, 1815 marks the dawn of Pax Britannica, a century where Britain, backed by industry, finance, and its navy, stands as the world's hegemon. The Second Empire isn't merely survival. It's the launchpad for global dominance. Pax Britannica, global power, 1815 to 1870. 1815, Napoleon defeated at Waterloo. For the first time in centuries, there's no rival power at sea. Britain owns the oceans. This is Pax Britannica, an age when the Royal Navy enforces global peace, but really serves British trade. At home, the Industrial Revolution rockets Britain ahead. Coal, steam, iron, factories. By mid-1800s, it produces over half the world's cotton, textiles, and iron. London becomes the global finance hub, its banks and insurance firms powering empire overseas. Abroad, expansion accelerates. In India, after crushing the 1857 rebellion, the East India Company is abolished and direct crown rule begins, the start of the British Raj. India, with 200 million people, becomes the empire's jewel, supplying cotton, opium, soldiers, and taxes. In the Caribbean, slavery is abolished in 1833, while in Africa Britain leads anti-slavery patrols off West Africa's coast, seizing thousands of slave ships. Yet at the same time, Britain expands territorial control, especially key ports like Cape Colony. Across the Pacific, New Zealand becomes a formal colony. Australia grows through wool exports and gold rushes, and Canada gains self-governing institutions. Together, these settler colonies form a white dominion's core, linked by migration and trade. Trade isn't just breadth, it's dominance. British merchants control 40% of world trade, shaping globalization before the word existed. Tea from China, opium forced back into China, cotton textiles everywhere. Its empire built on commerce as much as conquest. The empire's power also has a moral mission, civilizing rhetoric, missionary movements, spreading English law and education. Infrastructure like railways and telegraphs sprawls across colonies, binding the global network tighter. Outcome? Between 1815 and 1870, Britain doesn't just have an empire. It has the empire, the largest economy, the strongest navy, an unmatched colonial power, a quarter of the world's people touched by its networks. Long-term, this age creates Britain's peak confidence, the sense it can shape the globe. Yet the seeds of challenge, rising US and German industry, are already sprouting. For now, though, it's undisputed, the world's first hyperpower. High noon of empire, 1870 to 1914. By 1870, Britain rules the seas, drives global trade, and controls vast colonies. This is the height of empire, the country on which the sun never sets. At its peak, Britain governs a quarter of the Earth's land and people, 400 million subjects, territories from Africa to Asia to the Pacific. The scramble for Africa defines the age. At the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, European powers carved the continent like a map game. Britain seizes Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, Nigeria, and East Africa. Diamonds and gold fuel South Africa's fortunes. Control of the Suez Canal, 1875, gives Britain the vital lifeline to India. In India, the Raj is formalized after the 1857 uprising. Delhi's Mughal dynasty abolished. Queen Victoria crowned empress in 1877. Railways, telegraphs, and centralized administration tie India tightly into the imperial machine, though at heavy cost to local industries. India becomes both market and manpower, supplying raw cotton, soldiers, and future nationalists. Meanwhile, the White Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, gain increasing self-government under the Commonwealth model, forging cultural bonds but keeping local autonomy. Migration and trade strengthen ties, as wheat, wool, and meat flow to British cities. Global trade is Britain's bloodline. By 1900, its empire carries nearly half the world's shipping, and pounds sterling dominate finance. London becomes the banker of humanity. The empire is also technological, steamships, telegraphs, and railways knitted into a global system. But beneath the pride are cracks. Germany and the United States industrialize faster and challenge Britain's lead. German naval buildup and U.S. economic muscle generate unease. Boers resist fiercely in South Africa, dragging Britain into brutal wars, 1899 to 1902, exposing weaknesses. Nationalist movements stir in India, Egypt, and Ireland. Outcome? By 1914, Britain still commands the greatest empire the world has ever seen. But it's overstretched, globally vast, regionally unstable, and increasingly outcompeted. Long-term, it's the empire's zenith in size, but also the start of decline. On the eve of World War I, Britain stands tall, but the shadows of stronger rivals and global conflict are already forming. World Wars and Fragile Empire, 1914 to 1947. 1914, Britain enters World War I at its imperial peak. The empire mobilizes on a staggering scale. From India alone, over 1.3 million soldiers serve, alongside Canadians at Vimy Ridge, Australians at Gallipoli, and Africans on every front. Colonial troops fight and die for a war that isn't theirs. Victory in 1918 brings gains, mandates in the Middle East, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan. Yet the cost is immense. Debt, casualties, and sparks of rebellion. The Amritsar Massacre, 1919, in India fuels independence movements. The interwar years strain the empire. The Statute of Westminster, 1931, grants dominions like Canada, Australia, and South Africa virtual independence, weakening central control. Meanwhile, India's independence movement erupts under Gandhi and Nehru, demanding full freedom. Nationalism brews in Egypt, the Caribbean, and Africa. Economically, the Great Depression hits exports, undermining imperial cohesion. 1939, World War II. Again, the empire is vital. 2.5 million Indian troops, African regiments, Canadians, Anzacs, the largest volunteer army in history. Yet Japan's blitzkrieg shatters Britain's aura of invincibility. The fall of Singapore in 1942 is called the worst disaster in British military history. It shows Asian subjects that empire can bleed. By 1945, Britain is victorious but ruined, financially drained, cities bombed, prestige shattered. The US and USSR now dominate world power. Britain simply lacks the wealth to hold its empire together. The breaking point comes in Asia. India gains independence in 1947, its partition creating Pakistan and sparking mass violence and displacement. The jewel in the crown is gone. For centuries, India had anchored Britain's imperial system. Without it, the empire's global heart collapses. Outcome? Between 1914 and 1947, the empire shifts from unmatched global machine to overstretched relic. Participation in the world wars showcased its vast reach, but also exposed the unsustainable cost. Long-term, World War I cracked the empire, World War II broke it, and Indian independence delivered the decisive blow. The British Empire is no longer an eternal force. It's now a declining power racing toward decolonization. Winds of decolonization, 1947 to 1997. In 1947, the jewel of the empire, India, is gone. Partition creates India and Pakistan, unleashing massacres and the migration of 14 million people, one of history's largest human displacements. The loss of India is the death knell. The rest of the empire unravels quickly. Through the 1950s, African and Asian colonies demand independence. Ghana, 1957, becomes the first sub-Saharan African nation freed. By the mid-60s, most of Africa follows. Britain's Caribbean colonies win sovereignty in waves. Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados. The empire becomes less a map of red, more a patchwork of retreat. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is the turning point. Britain invades Egypt to hold the canal, but US and Soviet pressure force withdrawal. The message is global. Britain is no longer a superpower. Real authority lies in Washington and Moscow. Meanwhile, settler dominions continue evolving into independent nations with strong British ties. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand build welfare states and new identities, while South Africa veers into apartheid rule and later leaves the Commonwealth. By the 1980s and 90s, the process is nearly complete. Hong Kong remains the last great colony, its skyscrapers symbolizing global trade power. In 1997, Britain formally hands it back to China under the One Country, Two Systems Agreement. The ceremony is widely seen as the end of the British Empire. Yet decolonization isn't tidy. Borders drawn by Britain fuel conflicts. India, Pakistan, the Middle East, Africa. Economic dependence lingers. And in many new nations, Britain's institutions, parliamentary systems, civil service, common law, remain embedded. Outcome? Between 1947 and 1997, Britain releases over 50 colonies, transforming from empire to small European state. Prestige collapses, but cultural and institutional legacies remain. Long-term, Out of the empire, the Commonwealth emerges, a voluntary network of nations tied by history, language, and sport. But make no mistake, this was the empire's sunset. In half a century, the largest empire in human history was dismantled, never to return. Legacy and the modern Commonwealth, 1997 to present. 1997, Hong Kong is handed back to China, the symbolic end of the empire. For the first time in 400 years, Britain no longer holds a major overseas possession. Yet the empire isn't buried. Its legacy is everywhere. The Commonwealth of Nations, now 56 members across every continent, connects 2.5 billion people, almost a third of humanity. Most were once colonies. They share English as a lingua franca, Westminster-style parliaments, common law courts, and familiar sports from cricket to rugby. The Commonwealth is voluntary, not enforced, a reminder that empire's skeleton still shapes global cooperation. But the legacy is double-edged. Britain left behind railways, schools, and legal systems, but also partitioned borders, economic dependency, and deep injustices. Conflicts from Kashmir to Palestine to much of Africa trace back to imperial lines drawn on maps. Debates over reparations, looted artifacts in British museums, and imperial memory dominate politics and culture, forcing Britain to confront its past. At home, empire echoes daily. London is a global city because the empire once spanned the globe. The NHS relies on doctors and nurses from former colonies. Migration reshaped Britain into a multicultural society, vibrant, diverse, but also contested. Post-Brexit, some politicians even invoked imperial nostalgia, promising a global Britain. And Britain's soft power still punches above its size. Shakespeare, the BBC, the Premier League, the monarchy. Think of the 2022 Commonwealth Games in Birmingham or global fascination with the Queen's funeral. These events prove the empire's cultural footprint hasn't vanished, even if the power behind it is gone. Outcome? Since 1997, Britain is no longer an empire, simply a middle power, but one whose imperial aftershocks ripple worldwide. Its influence lives not in colonies, but through language, law, migration, and culture. Long-term, the empire ended, but its legacy shapes the modern world. Every time you speak English, play cricket, use parliamentary democracy, or follow international law, you touch threads of an empire that formally died in 1997, but in truth, never really disappeared.